I was born into chaos. My earliest memories are fragmented, the sound of my parents arguing, the cold nights in our broken-down apartment, and the sense of always being on the edge of survival. My name is David, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that life doesn't hand you anything, you have to claw your way out of the pit. My father left when I was 6. My mother, bless her soul, did the best she could, but her battle with addiction meant I often went to bed hungry or spent nights in shelters. By the time I was 12, I was stealing food from the corner store just to get by. The streets became my playground, but they were cruel, teaching me lessons I was too young to learn. School was a distant concept. I attended sporadically, and when I did, I was the kid with worn-out shoes and a battered backpack held together with duct tape. The teachers tried to help, but I'd already built walls around myself. Trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. One thing that stayed with me was the church. On Sundays, a local pastor, Father Greg, would visit the shelter. He had this way of making you feel seen, even in a crowd. He'd hand out sandwiches, offer words of encouragement, and tell us that God had a plan for everyone. At the time, I couldn't believe it. How could there be a plan for someone like me? But those moments stuck with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a faint glimmer of hope. By 18, I was on my own. I worked odd jobs, construction, dishwashing, anything that paid cash under the table. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me afloat. I never let go of the idea that there had to be more to life than this, but I had no clue how to reach it. The turning point came when I was 25. My mother had passed away a year earlier, and I found myself spiraling, teetering on the edge of giving up entirely. That's when I stumbled across an old notebook she had kept. Inside, she'd written prayers for me, hopes that I'd find a way out, and a note that read, "David, don't let this world break you. You were born for something greater." It was like she was speaking to me from beyond the grave. That note became my anchor. When I turned 26, I made a vow. I would turn my life around, not just for myself, but for the memory of my mother and the faint echoes of Father Greg's sermons. I had no plan, no skills, and just $1,000 in savings from my odd jobs, but I had something new, determination. At 26, I stood at a crossroads. The world felt bigger than ever, and my $1,000 savings seemed laughable compared to the mountain I needed to climb. But I'd made my vow, to honor my mother's memory and to change my story. It was time to get to work. I started by looking inward. What skills did I have? Not many. My resume was a patchwork of dead-end jobs, and I had no formal education to speak of. Still, I had my grit, and I'd learned to read people on the streets, a skill I figured had to count for something. One Sunday, I went back to Father Greg's church for the first time in years. It wasn't for the sermon, but for the sense of calm that place always gave me. After the service, I stayed back and spoke with Father Greg. I told him about my vow, my plan to turn my life around, and my pitiful $1,000 starting point. "You've already taken the hardest step, David," he said. "You've decided to change. Now, pray for guidance, but don't wait for a miracle, start building one with your own hands." The next morning, I went to the library and spent hours researching how to invest. Stocks, real estate, flipping items, it was overwhelming. Then I came across something that clicked, reselling undervalued items. It wasn't glamorous, but it was simple. Buy low, sell high. I could do that. I started scouring thrift stores and garage sales, looking for anything I could flip for a profit. My first find was a box of old vinyl records. They cost me $30, and after some careful cleaning and a few eBay listings, I sold them for $150. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time, I felt like I had control over my life. With my small success, I reinvested every penny. I started waking up at dawn to hit estate sales and flea markets. I found old furniture, rare books, and vintage electronics, anything that had value. Each sale taught me something new about negotiation, marketing, and persistence. But it wasn't smooth sailing. A month in, I made a rookie mistake. I spent $200 on a set of antique-looking watches, only to find out they were cheap reproductions worth less than $50 total. That loss stung, but it also taught me a valuable lesson: do your homework. By the end of that first year, I'd turned my $1,000 into $14,000. It wasn't hundreds of thousands yet, but I was building momentum. I started dreaming bigger. What if I could scale this? What if I could create something lasting? Little did I know, the next chapter of my life would test everything I'd built so far. The first year had been a whirlwind of discovery. Turning $1,000 into $14,000 felt like a small miracle, but I knew it wasn't enough to reach my ultimate goal. I needed a strategy to multiply my earnings faster, and that meant taking bigger risks. It was the start of my second year, and I decided to branch out. While I continued reselling items, I wanted to invest in something with higher stakes. That's when I stumbled upon an article about real estate wholesaling. The concept was simple: find undervalued properties, secure them under contract, and then sell the contracts to investors for a profit, all without actually owning the properties. It was like flipping items on a grander scale. The catch? It required confidence, negotiation skills, and the ability to spot opportunities. I used $5,000 of my savings to sign up for a weekend seminar on real estate investing. It felt like a gamble. What if it was just a scam? But I reasoned that even if I learned just one valuable skill, it would be worth it. The seminar opened my eyes to a new world. They taught us how to find distressed properties, approach owners, and network with cash buyers. For the first time, I felt like I had a roadmap. Within weeks, I put my knowledge to the test. I found a small, run-down property on the edge of town. The owner was an older woman who couldn't afford the repairs. I mustered up the courage to approach her and made an offer to secure the property under contract for $50,000, contingent on finding a buyer. With her agreement, I hustled to find an investor willing to take the deal. After dozens of phone calls and a few dead ends, I finally found one. They paid $55,000 for the contract, and just like that, I walked away with $5,000 in profit. I was hooked. The adrenaline rush of closing that deal was unlike anything I'd experienced. Over the next few months, I repeated the process, fine-tuning my approach. Some deals fell through, and I faced setbacks, like the time a property owner backed out at the last second, leaving me scrambling to cover expenses. But with each failure, I learned and adapted. By mid-year, I had netted $70,000 from wholesaling alone. Combined with my reselling business, my total earnings were approaching six figures. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, but I still felt like something was missing. During one of my visits to Father Greg's church, he pulled me aside. "You've done well, David," he said. "But remember, wealth without purpose is empty. What are you building all this for?" His words lingered. It wasn't the first time I'd thought about my deeper purpose, but I had been too focused on survival to fully address it. That night, I looked at the crumpled note from my mother that I kept in my wallet: "You were born for something greater." I realized I wasn't just chasing money, I was chasing meaning. My journey wasn't just about changing my life, it was about becoming someone who could change the lives of others. By the time I hit six figures, my life had transformed in ways I couldn't have imagined just 2 years earlier. I had a savings account that wasn't empty, I walked into stores without worrying about price tags, and I finally felt like I had control over my destiny. But Father Greg's words haunted me. What was I building all this for? That question became the backdrop to my second year. I spent nights lying awake, wondering if wealth alone was enough to satisfy the void I'd been trying to fill. Then, as if the universe was listening, I found myself sitting in church one Sunday listening to a missionary speak. His name was Matthew, and he talked about his work building wells in impoverished villages. "We take clean water for granted," Matthew said, his voice trembling with passion. But for some, it's the difference between life and death. I gave up a comfortable life to serve, and I've never been richer. His words hit me like a thunderbolt. Could I do something like that? Could I turn my newfound fortune into a force for good? That same day, I decided to redirect my investments towards something bigger. I didn't know exactly what yet, but I knew my path wasn't just about accumulating money anymore. First, though, I needed to secure my financial foundation. In the second half of my second year, I made my boldest move yet. I entered the stock market. I'd been hesitant before, worried about the volatility and the risks, but I realized that playing it safe wouldn't get me where I wanted to go. I devoured books, watched videos, and studied the basics of value investing. Then, I took a deep breath and invested $50,000 across a handful of promising companies. The first month was nerve-wracking. The market dipped, and I saw my portfolio shrink by 10%. I panicked, almost pulling my money out, but then I remembered what I'd learned: stay the course. The second month brought a slight rebound, and by the third month, I was in the green. One of my investments, a clean energy startup, surged by 50%, netting me a $20,000 profit. I felt invincible, until the crash came. A geopolitical crisis rattled the markets, and within weeks, I watched 30% of my portfolio evaporate. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All the progress I'd made seemed fragile, and for the first time in months, doubt crept in. Was I just another fool chasing riches? But this wasn't the first time life had knocked me down. I leaned on the resilience I'd built over years of hardship and decided to adapt. I pulled back, shifted my strategy, and diversified my investments into safer assets while keeping a portion in high-risk, high-reward stocks. Slowly but surely, I climbed back. By the end of my second year, my net worth had reached $400,000. I was on the brink of something extraordinary, but I knew the real test was yet to come. My next move would determine whether I could truly reach my goal, and if I could find the deeper purpose I was searching for. When I crossed the $400,000 mark, I should have been ecstatic. I'd beaten the odds, climbed out of the pit of poverty, and created a life I once thought impossible. But instead of feeling fulfilled, I felt restless. I couldn't shake the question Father Greg had posed to me: what are you building all this for? One evening, while reviewing my portfolio, I remembered Matthew, the missionary who'd spoken about building wells. I realized I wanted more than financial success, I wanted impact. I wanted my life to mean something beyond numbers in a bank account. That night, I prayed for clarity. The next morning, I had an idea. It wasn't fully formed, but I knew I wanted to start giving back. I took 10% of my earnings, about $40,000, and donated it to a nonprofit that built schools in underprivileged communities. It was a small step, but it lit a fire in me. For the first time, I felt like my wealth wasn't just mine, it was a tool to help others. Meanwhile, I continued to scale my investments. I returned to real estate, focusing on rental properties this time. With $200,000 of my capital, I purchased 2 small duplexes in an up-and-coming neighborhood. I used the rest to renovate them, ensuring they were safe and attractive for tenants. It was a significant risk, but I believed in the potential for steady, long-term income. For months, I threw myself into the work. I negotiated with contractors, navigated city permits, and learned the ins and outs of property management. There were hiccups, of course. One contractor ran off with $10,000 before finishing their work. Another tenant defaulted on rent, forcing me into an uncomfortable eviction process. But the challenges only strengthened my resolve. By mid-year, both duplexes were fully rented, and I was earning $5,000 a month in passive income. With that steady stream, I began reinvesting in stocks and exploring other opportunities. One of those opportunities came in the form of a struggling local coffee shop. The shop, owned by a single mother named Elena, was on the verge of closing. I met her by chance while scouting properties, and her story reminded me of my own mother's struggles. After learning about her situation, I offered her a deal. I'd invest $50,000 in exchange for a 40% stake in the business, but she would retain operational control. She agreed. I worked closely with Elena to revamp the shop's branding, introduce new menu items, and launch a social media campaign. Within 6 months, sales had doubled, and the shop was thriving. It wasn't just a financial win, it was a personal victory. Seeing Elena succeed gave me a sense of purpose that no investment portfolio ever could. As the year drew to a close, I took stock of my journey. My net worth had climbed to $750,000. More importantly, I was beginning to understand that wealth wasn't the destination, it was the vehicle. I was building something far greater than I'd imagined, a life of service, fueled by the very tools I'd once thought were out of my reach. But I wasn't a millionaire yet, and the final stretch would demand everything I had. By the start of my 3rd year, I was staring at a milestone that felt tantalizingly close but just out of reach, the $1 million mark. I was determined to hit it, not just for the financial accomplishment but to prove to myself that I could break the chains of my past. But if the last 2 years had taught me anything, it was that success demanded both strategy and resilience. My first move that year was to double down on my rental properties. The 2 duplexes I had purchased were performing well, but I wanted to scale further. I took a calculated risk and used the equity I'd built in those properties to secure a loan for a 10-unit apartment complex in a neighboring town. It was a rundown building, but the location was excellent, and I saw potential. Renovating the complex was a massive undertaking. Contractors were slow, costs ballooned, and I found myself managing everything from plumbing issues to tenant disputes. At one point, I was so overwhelmed that I considered selling the property just to cut my losses. But I pushed through, and by the summer, all 10 units were rented, providing a steady cash flow of $8,000 per month. That property alone pushed my net worth past $850,000. While the real estate side of my portfolio stabilized, I began exploring another opportunity: startups. I'd always been hesitant about startups because of their high risk, but the potential rewards were undeniable. After months of research, I invested $50,000 in a tech company developing a platform to connect small farmers with buyers directly, cutting out middlemen. It aligned with my newfound mission of impact, and the pitch made sense. However, just as things were looking up, disaster struck. A fire broke out in one of my duplexes, displacing tenants and causing tens of thousands of dollars in damage. I was crushed, not just financially but emotionally. I'd worked so hard to build stability, and in an instant, it felt like it was slipping away. For days, I wrestled with doubt. Had I stretched myself too thin? Was I doomed to fail after coming so far? But then I remembered where I'd started, with nothing but $1,000 and a dream. This was just another obstacle, not the end. I leaned on my faith, took a deep breath, and got to work. Insurance covered most of the repair costs, and I personally worked with the tenants to ensure they had temporary housing. The experience taught me that wealth isn't just about money, it's about responsibility. Those tenants trusted me, and I couldn't let them down. By the final quarter of the year, things began to turn around. The tech startup I'd invested in announced a partnership with a major retailer, doubling the value of my shares overnight. My rental properties were fully operational again, and my coffee shop venture with Elena continued to thrive. I even started mentoring a few young entrepreneurs who reminded me of myself at the start of this journey. Then, in December, it happened. I sat down to calculate my net worth. Between my real estate holdings, business investments, and stock portfolio, I'd crossed the $1 million mark. I sat there in silence, overwhelmed. I thought about my mother's note, Father Greg's wisdom, and all the nights I'd gone to bed hungry as a kid. I'd done it. I'd become a millionaire. But more importantly, I'd become something else, a man with a purpose. Entering my 3rd year, I was both excited and anxious. My net worth had climbed to $750,000, but the $1 million mark still felt like a distant dream. I knew this year would be the ultimate test, a combination of everything I'd learned so far and the faith I'd built along the way. I decided to double down on what had worked before, real estate and strategic investments in small businesses. But I also knew I needed to explore new opportunities if I wanted to break through. The first big move of the year came when I identified a plot of land on the outskirts of town. The area was being eyed for development, and while the land was cheap now, I could see the potential. It was a risky play, as I would need to hold on to the land for at least a year before its value appreciated. Still, I trusted my instincts and bought it for $150,000, leaving me with about $200,000 in liquid assets for other ventures. Meanwhile, my 2 duplexes were generating steady income, and Elena's coffee shop was thriving. She'd even expanded to catering events, increasing profits by another 30%. Inspired by that success, I began looking for other small businesses with untapped potential. That's when I found a struggling food truck run by 2 brothers, Marco and Luis. Their cooking was incredible, but their business sense was lacking. They had no marketing strategy, no system for managing orders, and were drowning in debt. I approached them with an offer similar to the one I'd made Elena. I'd invest $75,000 in exchange for a 50% stake. They hesitated at first, but when I laid out my plan, rebranding, streamlining operations, and introducing online ordering, they agreed. Over the next 6 months, we turned their food truck into a sensation. We launched an Instagram page, partnered with local breweries, and expanded their menu. By the summer, their revenue had tripled, and the food truck was booked solid at events across the city. But not everything went smoothly. Halfway through the year, I faced my biggest crisis yet. The real estate market, which had been climbing steadily, suddenly cooled. The plot of land I'd purchased hadn't appreciated as expected, and there was talk of the development project being delayed indefinitely. Panic set in. Had I overextended myself? Was I about to lose everything? For weeks, I wrestled with doubt. I considered selling the land at a loss just to cut my ties, but something held me back. A conversation with Father Greg reminded me of the importance of patience and faith. "You've come too far to give up now," he told me. "Trust the seeds you've planted." So, I held on, and in a surprising turn of events, the development project was greenlit in the fall. Investors started snapping up properties in the area, and the land I'd bought for $150,000 sold for $300,000, a profit of $150,000 in just under a year. By the end of the 3rd year, my net worth had finally crossed $1 million. I'd done it. The kid who once slept in shelters and stole food to survive was now a millionaire. But the number in my bank account wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the person I'd become along the way. I decided to take my mother's words to heart: "You were born for something greater." With my newfound wealth, I launched a foundation focused on providing mentorship and financial literacy programs for underprivileged youth, kids like me, who just needed someone to believe in them. As I stood on the threshold of this new chapter, I realized that the journey wasn't about money at all. It was about impact. It was about taking the life I'd been given and turning it into a blessing for others. Crossing the $1 million milestone was surreal. I remember sitting alone in my tiny apartment, staring at the bank statement on my laptop. I thought I'd feel elated, but instead, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, gratitude, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. What now? The answer came to me one evening while volunteering at Father Greg's church. A young boy named Malik approached me. He reminded me so much of myself at his age, shy, with a worn jacket 2 sizes too big. He told me he wanted to grow up and make a lot of money so I can get my mom a nice house. His words stayed with me. I thought about how I'd started with nothing but grit, determination, and a few lucky breaks. What if I could be the one to create opportunities for kids like Malik? That night, I started drafting a plan for a foundation. The foundation would focus on providing mentorship, financial literacy, and entrepreneurship programs to underprivileged youth. I named it the Greater Purpose Initiative, inspired by the words my mother had written, "You were born for something greater." But starting a foundation wasn't cheap, and I didn't want to drain my savings. So, I began looking for ways to expand my portfolio. Building momentum. I continued managing my rental properties and helped Elena expand her coffee shop into a second location. Marco and Luis had plans to launch a second food truck, and I gladly invested in that too. These ventures were now providing a steady stream of income, but I needed something bigger to fund my foundation's ambitious goals. That's when I met Sarah, a real estate investor who specialized in flipping multifamily units. We connected through a mutual contact, and she introduced me to the concept of syndication deals, pooling money with other investors to buy large apartment complexes. It was risky but had the potential for massive returns. I invested $200,000 into a syndication deal for a 50-unit apartment complex in a growing city. Sarah assured me the area's rental demand was skyrocketing, and within 6 months, her predictions proved correct. The property's value soared, and my share of the profits exceeded $100,000. Encouraged by this success, I reinvested the profits into another syndication deal and set aside $50,000 to officially launch the Greater Purpose Initiative. A new mission. The foundation's first project was small but impactful, a series of free workshops on financial literacy for teenagers in my old neighborhood. The turnout exceeded my expectations, and seeing the kids' excitement reminded me why I started this journey. One of the boys, Malik, stood out. He had a sharp mind and an insatiable curiosity about investing. I started mentoring him personally, teaching him everything I'd learned over the past 3 years. Helping Malik and other kids gave me a sense of fulfillment that money never could. Every time I saw a child grasp a concept or dream bigger than their circumstances, I felt like I was honoring my mother's memory. But my journey wasn't over yet. The foundation was gaining momentum, and I wanted to scale its impact. I knew that if I kept pushing forward, I could change even more lives. By the time the Greater Purpose Initiative had its first full year under its belt, I realized just how much work was ahead. The workshops were a success, but they barely scratched the surface of what I wanted to accomplish. My vision was clear: I wanted to create a nationwide program that could help underprivileged kids break the cycle of poverty, just as I had. But scaling up wasn't going to be easy. Running a foundation was an entirely different challenge than building personal wealth. Every step required planning, connections, and, most of all, funding. While I was no stranger to hustling, the stakes felt higher. I wasn't just investing for myself anymore, I was building something for others. Diversifying investments. To generate steady funding for the foundation, I began diversifying my investments further. My experience in real estate had taught me the value of patience and strategic risk, but I wanted to expand into areas I hadn't explored before. One such opportunity came when a tech startup approached me for funding. They were developing an app to connect gig workers with local opportunities more efficiently. It aligned with my mission to support hardworking people trying to get ahead, so I invested $100,000 in exchange for equity. At first, the startup struggled to gain traction. The launch was delayed, and user growth was slower than expected. I started to doubt my decision. But instead of pulling out, I decided to help. I used my network to connect the founders with a marketing expert I'd met during my real estate ventures. Within 3 months, the app's user base began to grow, and by the end of the year, it was generating revenue. That investment paid off handsomely. My $100,000 stake turned into $250,000, and I funneled a significant portion of the profits into the foundation. Expanding the foundation. With more funding secured, I hired a small team to help expand the Greater Purpose Initiative. We started building partnerships with schools, churches, and community centers across the state. Our programs now included mentorship, vocational training, and even small business grants for teens with entrepreneurial ideas. One of my proudest moments came when Malik, the boy I'd started mentoring, won one of our grants to launch his own online clothing store. Watching him present his business plan to a panel of investors brought tears to my eyes. He reminded me so much of myself at that age, and I knew he was on the path to a brighter future. Challenges along the way. But success didn't come without setbacks. The tech startup I'd invested in hit a rough patch when a competitor entered the market with a similar app. Revenues stalled, and my equity's value dropped significantly. For months, I worried about how it might impact the foundation's funding. At the same time, one of my rental properties required unexpected repairs after a tenant caused significant damage. The costs were higher than I anticipated, cutting into my income. For the first time in years, I felt the familiar stress of financial pressure creeping back. Still, I leaned on the lessons I'd learned over the years. I diversified my income streams, worked harder to secure new partnerships for the foundation, and stayed patient with my investments. By the end of the year, things stabilized. The app regained its footing with a new feature, and my real estate portfolio continued to generate steady cash flow. More importantly, the foundation was thriving, reaching hundreds of kids across the state. But I wasn't content to stop there. The journey had taught me that every challenge was an opportunity to grow, and I was determined to take the Greater Purpose initiative to even greater heights. In the 4th year of my journey, I began to see the full potential of what the Greater Purpose initiative could become. Our programs were making waves in the community, and word was spreading. Parents, educators, and even local politicians started reaching out, asking how they could support or replicate our efforts. This was a turning point. Up until then, I'd been focused on building a foundation that could sustain itself through my investments. But now, I saw the value of partnerships and collaboration. If I wanted to reach more kids, I couldn't do it alone. Building alliances. I began meeting with community leaders and pitching the idea of expanding the foundation's reach. One of those meetings was with a local tech company CEO, Marissa, who had grown up in a similar environment to mine. She resonated with the foundation's mission and offered to sponsor a pilot program that would teach coding and technology skills to underprivileged youth. Marissa's support was a game changer. Her sponsorship not only covered the costs of the program but also brought credibility to the foundation. Other companies took notice, and within months, we had secured additional partnerships with local businesses, tech firms, and even a university that wanted to offer scholarships to kids in our programs. At the same time, I launched a crowdfunding campaign to raise awareness and funds. I shared my story, how I'd gone from sleeping in shelters to building a life of purpose, and people responded. Donations poured in, and we raised over $200,000 in just a few months. Scaling the vision. With the additional funding and partnerships, we were able to expand the foundation's program statewide. We hired more mentors, developed online courses, and created a network of alumni who could give back by mentoring the next generation of participants. One of the highlights of the year was hosting our first statewide youth entrepreneurship competition. Dozens of kids presented their business ideas to a panel of judges, including some of the investors and entrepreneurs I'd met during my journey. The winning idea came from a 17-year-old girl named Tasha, who developed a subscription box service featuring products from local artisans. Watching Tasha pitch her idea with confidence and win the competition was one of the proudest moments of my life. It reminded me why I'd started this journey, not to make money for the sake of it, but to create opportunities for others to rise above their circumstances. A crisis of faith. But even with all the progress, the year wasn't without challenges. Managing the foundation's rapid growth was overwhelming, and I found myself questioning if I was the right person to lead it. The financial setbacks from the previous year still lingered in my mind, and I worried about letting down the people who believed in me. One evening, I visited Father Greg and shared my doubts. He listened patiently and then said, "David, you've been given this journey for a reason. The road isn't supposed to be easy. It's supposed to shape you, prepare you, and remind you that your strength comes from something greater than yourself. His words gave me the clarity I needed. I wasn't just building a foundation, I was building faith, resilience, and a legacy that would outlive me. As the year ended, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation was thriving, my investments were stabilizing, and my vision for the future was clearer than ever. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. The real work, the kind that changes lives and transforms communities, was only getting started. In my 5th year, everything I'd worked for began to crystallize. The Greater Purpose Initiative wasn't just a foundation anymore, it was a movement. We'd expanded into 3 neighboring states, reaching thousands of kids and families. What had started as a personal mission to honor my mother's memory had grown into something far greater than I ever imagined. A transformative moment. One day, I was invited to speak at a youth conference attended by over 500 kids from underprivileged backgrounds. As I stood on the stage, looking out at all those hopeful faces, I felt the weight of my journey. I shared my story, the hardships, the risks, the failures, and the victories. Toward the end of my speech, I held up the crumpled note I'd carried with me all these years, the one my mother had written, "You were born for something greater." I kept this with me, I told them, to remind myself that no matter how hard life gets, we all have a purpose. You're not defined by where you start, but by how you choose to move forward. The crowd erupted in applause, but the moment that stayed with me came afterward. Malik, now 18 and running a successful online clothing store, introduced me to his younger brother. "He's got big dreams too," Malik said, grinning. That moment felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked for. It wasn't just about lifting myself out of poverty, it was about creating a ripple effect, inspiring others to dream bigger, and giving them the tools to succeed. The road ahead. By this time, my personal wealth had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. My real estate portfolio included multiple properties, my investments in small businesses and startups continued to pay dividends, and I'd become a sought-after mentor for aspiring entrepreneurs. But wealth had taken on a new meaning for me. It wasn't about the cars, the vacations, or the prestige. It was about the lives I could touch, the opportunities one could create, and the legacy I could leave behind. I began thinking about the long-term sustainability of the foundation. To ensure it could thrive even after I was gone, I worked with advisors to set up an endowment fund. I also wrote a book about my journey, with all proceeds going to the foundation. A personal milestone. On the anniversary of my mother's passing, I visited her grave. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the sting of loss as sharply. Instead, I felt a deep sense of peace. "I did it, Mom," I said, laying down a bouquet of her favorite flowers. "I built something greater, just like you believed I could." Closing the chapter. Today, as I look back on my journey, I'm filled with gratitude. Gratitude for the hardships that shaped me, the people who believed in me, and the lessons I learned along the way. The Greater Purpose Initiative now impacts tens of thousands of lives, and I know this is only the beginning. The seeds we've planted will continue to grow, creating opportunities for generations to come. I'm no longer just David, the boy who grew up with nothing. I'm David, the man who turned his pain into purpose, his struggles into strength, and his dreams into reality. And if there's one thing I hope people take from my story, it's this: no matter where you start, you can always choose to write a new ending. This is my legacy.